we need to look at something astounding that happened over the course of like 100 years. This is the final chapter, and what I think is the most mind-boggling chapter in the story of how Europe took over the world. The reason why it's so mind-boggling is because this is the part of the story where the map goes from looking like this in 1800, with Europe controlling like 35% of the world's land, to looking like this by 1914. With 84% of the Earth being controlled by the people, or the descendants of the people, from this once isolated continent, Europe. 84%. How on earth did this happen? A huge part of this next chapter has to do with this continent, the second largest continent on Earth, and the part of the world that the Europeans hadn't really carved up yet. So this is where the whole story comes together. It shows us how technology and different ways of thinking helped these people take over the world, and in the process, shaped the world we live in today. The way that we trade, where we get our stuff, the language I'm using to speak to you right now, and most of you understand it even though you don't live anywhere near the place where it was invented. I'm telling you, this isn't far away history anymore. This is the world we currently live in. So let me show you the third and final chapter of how Europe stole the world. Another video, another set of beautiful printed maps. And I'm telling you, this is the chapter where the maps get really good. Cartography really took off. Okay, let's get up to speed on where we're at. Remember, it all started with Spain and Portugal. They ramped up this colonialism thing back around 1500. And this led them to divide the world between them until other European countries got in on it too. Then the real competition started. The Dutch created the modern corporation, which allowed them to speed all of this up. The world quickly turned into a giant marketplace, run by Europeans with boats and guns and incentives to bring profits to the shareholders back home. This is all a huge part of the story, but I'm telling you, when it comes to scale, imperialism is just getting started. And that's because Europeans are about to level up. We're gonna call this Imperialism 2.0, a new way of taking over the world, fueled mostly by technology and a rare cooperation between all of these empires. One British Prime Minister described this Imperialism 2.0 as, quote, the vulgar and bastard imperialism of irritation and aggression, of grabbing everything, even if we had no use for it. But let me tell you, if you're like me and you kind of have a low-key implicit belief that European domination was inevitable and that this was going to happen no matter what, I'm here to tell you that it almost didn't happen. That's because by the end of the 1700s, revolution was in the air. Empires were losing their colonies, starting with a group of Europeans who were done having a king and declaring independence for themselves in the late 1700s. Soon you had a bunch of Spanish colonies declaring independence. And then over here in Haiti, you had enslaved people who were organizing and rebelling against their French masters, throwing them out and starting their own country. These empires weren't only losing their colonies. Back in Europe, one ruler even lost his head in all of this. The empires were losing their grip, and soon they were fighting with one another like never before. It was chaos, and it totally freaked these European rulers out. Are they losing their empire? Are they going to lose their reins on power? Is the era of abundance and domination coming to an end? No, we can't let this happen. So they start doing something that was kind of unheard of. Instead of fighting and competing with each other, like they've always done, the European powers start talking to each other. Their empires were in jeopardy and they needed to collaborate, find ways to share power both at home in Europe, but also on the world stage. Soon, this new culture of diplomacy and collaboration would turn to focus on the one continent that none of these European powers had carved up yet, the new imperial frontier. Certainly full of resources, but not yet conquered. I mean, the maps tell the story here. The maps were like a record of what Europeans knew and didn't know about the world. I mean, this one British map from 1800s says it all. Look at this thing. Europeans were definitely familiar with Africa, especially here in the coast, where for hundreds of years they had trading posts and, of course, the Atlantic slave trade. But look how they map the interior of the continent. It literally just gives up and is like inland parts, almost entirely unknown, which is pretty rare for this time period. At this point, the Europeans had really mapped a lot of the world, but this place was off limits. It was the stuff of legend, of myths. The caption here on the map says that this interior part of Africa may be considered as absolutely unknown or completely unexplored. All we know, says the map, is that its immense and arid sands are intersected with complete collections of the most ferocious beasts and most uncivilized men. That's all they know. There was a very good reason for this. The fact is that soldiers and explorers from Europe who went into this area, a lot of them didn't come home. Up to 40% died from diseases like the mosquito-borne illness malaria. So much so that this part of the map became known as the white man's grave. Totally off limits. But that soon changed. Two giant things happen that change everything, completely redirect what Europeans can do with their mounting power. First, these two French guys are able to take the bark of this tree, which had been used for a very long time for a variety of purposes, and isolate a vital chemical called quinine. It combats malaria, the major killer of Europeans in Africa. They now have a white man's shield to protect them from the white man's grave. The door is slowly creaking open. Second, this guy happens. King Leopold II. He's the king of this new country called Belgium, and it existed for like 40 years. It's kind of a minor place in Europe, nothing like these OG colonizers. So it's like 1875, and King Leopold wants to play with the big boys. He wants a colony. So he literally goes around and starts asking these major colonial powers for like some of their land. Like he goes to the OGs, Spain and Portugal, and he's like, hey guys, I know you're in decline. Can I have one of your colonies? And they're like, no. So then he goes to the British and he's like, hey guys, I know you have New Guinea. Maybe you don't have any plans for it. You could give it to me. And they're like, no, Leo, don't you realize how hard we worked to steal this land? We're not just gonna give it to you as a handout. So King Leopold decides to take matters into his own hands. He turns to the map and decides this part of the map, the parts unknown, where none of the colonizers have arrived to yet, is a prime place for his colony. King Leopold sets his sight on the white man's grave. A quick reminder that this is kind of the fantasy of the Europeans who haven't explored this. In reality, at this point, Africa looks a lot more like this. But in the mind of King Leopold and other Europeans, it's a big blank canvas with unlimited possibilities. So Leopold sends explorers to like the dead center of this blank canvas. And they're armed not only with some of the latest and greatest weapons, but also with medicine that shields them from these killer tropical diseases. These Belgian explorers arrive and are able to make agreements with the locals, laying claim to this land. King Leopold now has his own little colony in the center of the white man's grave. And of course, they start mapping it. This is a map from a bunch of Belgian cartographers and explorers when they first arrive to this center part of Africa. Very little detail here at the beginning. This is 1880. They basically got this river, some of the offshoots, but they don't really know what's going on in here yet. This becomes the frame that Leopold uses to build his colony. Now, of course, this freaks the French out because they're like, hey, what's Belgium doing in Africa? Why are they exploring all this land? So they decide to send their own explorers to claim their own bit of land. After all, they've got the medicine. It's not nearly as dangerous, and the Belgians are doing it. Well, of course, now the British are waking up. They're sending people too. And even the new kid on the imperial block, Germany, is chipping in. And now suddenly, we've got a scramble on our hands. But wait, say the European powers, let's learn from our mistakes. Instead of the old days where we always had to fight over things, in this era of revolution and warfare, remember that we're trying to be better about talking to one another, coordinating, remember? So it's 1884, and all these big Africa-hungry European empires get together in Berlin. I mean, there's this amazing painting of just them all sitting here looking at this big, beautiful map, which would be like an amazing activity to do until you realize what's actually happening here. You've got the Chancellor of Germany, you've got the OG colonizers Portugal explaining this place to Belgium and France and Italy, and you've even got the new country, the United States, who showed up. Kind of new to all this imperial stuff, but quickly learning how power really works on the international international stage. Basically, anyone in Europe who didn't have an empire yet got in now. Oh, and crucially, they didn't invite any African leaders. And to be clear, this painting isn't like exaggerated, like it's not a political cartoon. This is literally a bunch of European dudes in a room in Berlin in 1884 discussing and coordinating how they're going to carve up and take this continent. And they decided that there was going to be one big rule for this new scramble for Africa. No pretending. None of this only on the map fake imperialism thing that the Pope arranged for Spain and Portugal a few hundred years previous. You actually have to control the land if you're going to claim it. So they divide up the map on who gets what, they leave the conference, and they get to work. The French start moving in quickly from West Africa. The British begin taking over Sudan and expanding north from down here in South Africa to take over all of this land. The Germans really start establishing themselves here and over here. Italy starts occupying all this land up here in the north and east. And Leopold, well, he got his colony. 77 times the size of Belgium. Here it was as a blank canvas when they first started exploring in 1880. Here it is 14 years later. Little Belgium down here, giant Congo up here. The blueprint has filled out. The conquest is complete. With his new colony, King Leopold, of course, went on to do horrible things, exploiting, pillaging the resources from this place, and wreaking horrible havoc on the people. And it is horrific and it is horrendous, and I made a whole other video that kind of goes into it more. I'll link to it and go to the sources in the description, please. Okay. All of these empires were carving up this map, coming in, mapping it very beautifully. It's like literally the opposite of what it was. It was unknown and now it's totally known. Pillaging the resources, bringing it back home, making record profits, etc., etc. And all of this carving, it happened really fast. But wait a minute, hold on, pause. How does this make any sense? Like, it made sense when it was all like on water and there were ships and there was domination and trading ports and all of that. But this is an incredibly logistically ambitious thing to do. Like, this was actually a central question for me that led me to make this series, because I just didn't understand how these countries in a matter of a few years could completely carve up the second largest continent. Well, the answer to that question isn't that surprising. These Europeans now had a leg up. They had new tools. Remember, they had invented capitalism to make them rich. That gave them time to do science, which gave them technology that they used to make their capitalism better and more effective, more productive. This cycle repeated itself over and over and over, giving Europeans a further and further leg up technologically, until soon they had stuff like this. A steamboat. You didn't have to worry about the wind anymore to keep going. You could just steam your way all the way up African rivers.
And the old African queen.
Or the railroad, a quick way to transport food and troops. Like, you can see this map. All of this red is either railroads that they put in or railroads that they were constructing at this time. This allowed Europeans to level up not just in Africa, but everywhere. I mean, here they are in India. The British quickly taking over this entire subcontinent of what today is India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, with this massive, complex rail system that they built basically in no time. They also invented the telegraph, which could now relay messages in a matter of minutes instead of weeks. I mean, this political cartoon really personifies how powerful this was. And of course, what we've been looking at this whole time. They made maps. Big, beautiful, juicy maps showing the geography and the people and all of the land that they had conquered. In addition to technology, these empires had also perfected the art of allying with local power holders and turning the people against each other, divide and conquer, which allowed a small group of Europeans to control millions of locals. And of course, they had these. These refined killing machines that allowed small groups of European soldiers to rip through truly formidable African armies. Like, look at this painting from Sudan, where the British used their guns to slaughter 10,000 enemies with just a few hundred losses. And here this casual caption showing that these savages were now mowed down by these modern weapons of war, clearing way for civilization. Now, it wasn't this easy everywhere. Descendants of white Dutch settlers held off the British for a long time down here in South Africa. And the Ethiopians were able to hold off the Italians from conquering their land, making it the only place in Africa to never be colonized. But listen, in the midst of all this bloodshed, we have to talk about something that doesn't fit cleanly into our narrative of good versus evil. Because the presence of these Europeans in this continent also brought really positive things. Remember those French dudes that discovered the treatment for malaria? Well, that was tested in the field in French Algeria, a colony. It changed medicine forever, giving us our modern understanding of mosquitoes and the diseases they spread. This scramble into Africa helped push forward our understanding of health and disease and medicine. These and tons of other medical developments helped these Europeans conquer land, but it also brought innovation that we